Okay, Pickslanting Primer Part 3, and what I'd like to talk about here is a bit of the black arts of the voodoo of alternate picking that I'd like to think, pioneered here a bit in cracking the code, and that is this concept of two-way pickslanting. This is perhaps the most mysterious of the things that we address in cracking the code, in the sense that it is really what enables alternate picking across the strings, using unusual combination of notes that really, for the most part, stump most players. Most players have some ability to do tremolo playing, and then when you get into downward pickslanting, there are a lot of players out there that use it that don't realize they use it. And once they understand what it is, they realize they've been doing it all along. But two-way pickslanting is combining downward pickslanting with its component, or its opposing concept, upward pickslanting, combining these two things together in one phrase to play ridiculously complicated, in some cases, combinations of notes per string. And this is what describes the techniques of legendary pure alternate pickers like Michelangelo Badio, John McLaughlin, Al Di Meola, Paul Gilbert, Vinnie Moore, these kinds of players. And the key concept to understand here is that two-way pickslanting is very simply a way to play. It is necessary for playing odd numbers of notes per string. That's the key here. Downward pickslanting, and more generally speaking, one-way pickslanting, is how you play even numbers of notes per string. And that, of course, downward pickslanting is the one that we've looked at. Upward pickslanting is the insight that takes us, it's the bridge to this world of two-way pickslanting. Down and up are essentially the same technique with the inverse picking structure. So in other words, if downward pickslanting allows you to play even numbers of notes per string and switch strings after upstrokes, these are all concepts we've talked about in the show, then upward pickslanting allows you to do exactly the same thing, but with the opposite pick strokes. So now you're switching strings after downstrokes, but you're still playing an even number of notes per string. And two-way pickslanting then takes these two concepts, fuses them together, and allows us to play an odd number of notes per string, or perhaps an even number of notes per string, if we don't change the pick angle. Now, basically, everything is fair game now. You can change the pick angle, you cannot change the pick angle, and you would do this based on the number of notes per string, right? And it gets complicated. If you have an even number of notes per string, you don't change the pick angle when you move to a new string. You have an odd number of notes per string, you do change it. And if you're starting to get the sense that guitar playing with a pick is actually highly structured, the answer is yeah, it is. This idea that you just sit there and play stuff and it just sort of comes out of your brain and flows right into the fretboard, it's not how it works. Elite players think that it works that way because that's how it works for them after many years of practice. It's just like when you speak English or whatever your native language is. A lot of times, and I was a language major in college, when you learn a new language, there are parts of your thinking that remain in your native language. And a lot of times we like to think that when you start doing math in the new language, that's when you've really kind of flipped that switch and you're now beginning to think like a native speaker. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that languages that you learn when you're really, really young, they burn in such a way that there may be a certain component of your thinking that always remains in that language. But the thing with two-way pickslanting is, even in its sophistication, or any of these pickslanting techniques really, is that when you become conversant in these rules, just as in language, you no longer think of them as rules. They no longer feel like restrictions. They are simply the way that you do things. And they become so memorized and patterned that you can then improvise with them. So this idea that improvisation is somehow breaking free of the rules and, I'm totally free, man. I play whatever comes into my mind using whatever pick strokes. Do you think I would plan out my pick strokes? That's crazy. I wouldn't do that. I'm an artist. Well, no, actually, it doesn't work that way. Everything you do is based on rules. And freedom, and this is going to sound very Matrix-like, but freedom is becoming so conversant in the rules that they seem no longer to exist. It's like seeing the Matrix. I can see the code, I know how it works, and I can just improvise with it freely, but there have to be rules. These are sophisticated problems. Picking across the strings is way complicated, and it is not a thing that you can just make up on the fly. It's a thing that evolves over many years of learning these patterns that happen to be clean. And when you watch players like Al Di Meola, for example, you will see that every time he plays certain licks, he uses the exact same sequence of picking movements. A great example of this is a chapter from the anti-gravity seminar on Al Di Meola's two-way pickslanting usage. And you can check this out on our YouTube channel. It's called Mechanics for Mixed Fingerings. And again, this idea that you can play even and odd numbers of notes per string using two-way pickslanting. We talk about the sixes pattern in that clip. And you can see very clearly, even from a mile away, back out in the audience, you can see his hand moving on stage under the lights. It's very clear what technique he's using. I've seen other clips and interviews with Al where he plays that lick, and it's the same hand movement every time. These things are not random. He had to learn it that way. He doesn't think about it that way, of course, but he had to learn it that way. So that's the Al Di Meola chapter. There are 3 other great chapters from Anti-Gravity, which is our discussion of two-way pixlanting. You can check these all out on our channel. There's like, I don't know, 28 or 30 chapters or something in Anti-Gravity total. We've taken 4 of some of the most interesting ones. There's the Vinny Moore one where we talk about the Pepsi lick, which is, again, the 6-note pattern. Vinny is an expert at this. He's primarily an upward pixlanter. He occasionally switches to downward pixlanting to make these odd number of notes per string patterns happen. The Pepsi lick's a great example of that. Then we've uploaded Paul Gilbert chapter as well. And here we're talking about the difference between inside and outside picking, which is a bit of a red herring concept that guitar players tend to be obsessed with. This idea that the pick is either stuck inside the strings or it's kind of stuck outside the strings and trying to get in. Turns out really not to have as much relevance anymore once you understand what pixlanting is, because the insight there is that there are plenty of licks that are, for example, inside picking licks that are easy. And yet, even if you're the kind of player that thinks of inside picking as hard, well, perhaps there might be 5 things that you already play that use inside picking that aren't hard at all. And you don't even think about it that way, because when something is easy, you don't notice it, right? So if you notice that a thing is hard, okay, that's one side of the observation, but there's the negative observation of what about the 20 other things that you're doing that are easy that are also inside picking? That right there disproves the theory, right? If you have a theory and we can find 10 counterexamples, I'm going to suggest that there's something wrong with the theory. And in this case, the theory is not that inside picking is hard. It's that most players have trouble figuring out two-way pixlanting by feel. All these inside picking patterns that people cite as being the difficult ones, they all involve two-way pixlanting. But I can show you 5 examples of inside picking that don't involve two-way pixlanting that most players would think of as easy. And so we look at a few examples of these in Paul Gilbert's playing, and we're trying to debunk this myth, this inside-outside picking myth, as a thing that we all need to care about. It really isn't. And then finally, there is a really fantastic chapter that we've uploaded from the Eric Johnson seminar, Cascade. And it's a chapter where Eric Johnson talks about two-way pixlanting in a manner of speaking. He is famously a one-way pixlanter, right? He's not a guy that uses two-way pixlanting. And yet, he's such an intuitive genius that he kind of gets that it's necessary. There are lines that he can't play, and he's trying on this one instructional video that we analyzed, The Fine Art of Guitar. He's trying to explain why he would need to use two-way pixlanting and how he's been trying to work on it. And he can't quite get over the hump, but it's incredible, really, that this was, 20 years ago or something, that he's basically foreseeing the need for this. And he's trying to figure out how to solve that problem in a more of an intellectual way, which is really not how most of these players solve these problems. These are things they do by feel and they just evolve over time. But here he is trying to figure it out, and we capture it on film. It's in the instructional video, and the guys filming this probably had no idea what they were watching. He's talking about a thing, they don't know what it is, they wrote some tablature and they moved on to the next scene. But here it is, preserved for posterity, amazingly fascinating description of just how sophisticated this problem of two-way pixlanting can really be.